Welcome back to Roland Martin Unfiltered, streaming live on the Black Star Network. Also, everybody, make sure you are liking and subscribing to the video. We got to make sure we get up over 1,000 likes so Roland, when he gets back from the golf course, knows we're actually putting into work over here. We're still talking to Stacy Washington, host of Stacy on the Right. And so before the break, we were talking a little bit about the economic policies of some of the Republican candidates versus that of President Biden's current administration. And you were discussing the comparison between the American levels of inflation versus some of the European governments. What would be a proper comparative model if UK, if France, if Germany aren't models to compare to? Who should we compare the American economy to with regards to inflationary pressures on the market?
So first off, if we're comparing, I like to compare to previous years of ourselves. So I would not compare our country to much tinier countries in Europe where they've formed a European Union to mimic our model. They don't have the same GDP. Each of our states has similar or greater GDPs to those of European nations. So standalone comparisons between one European nation and the entire country of America are not apples to apples comparisons. And you mentioned that there have been conservative governments who've been running the UK, but that does not control their actual economic policy. Those are elected officials and they enact policy, but it doesn't change the structure of their government. They are socialist in nature, and we are a free market capitalistic society. So they have single payer for healthcare. We do not. We have a free market healthcare system. So the comparison is not accurate.
And with that, when you say you want to compare America to previous years, are you comparing it to previous years specifically during the pandemic, or are you comparing it to other periods of time when America was in a similar situation as we are now? Because I find that the math often ends up skewed when you say, well, during President Trump, XYZ happened. Well, the world's economy was shut down because of COVID. So it's difficult to have a comparative model set upon an outlier situation. Aren't any indulgences created there to have a proper dollar for dollar economic exchange for what was happening then versus what is happening now?
So at the end of the Trump administration, we were experiencing a V-shaped recovery. The economy was rebounding and things were looking up. But there were 3 years before the pandemic where we had sound economic policy and a robust economy, near 0% inflation, and a robust GDP growth. So there are recent times with which we can compare the performance of the Biden administration, and the previous administration is the appropriate one to compare. And if you take out the pandemic as an outlier, the comparison between the two administrations is stark. Obviously, one of them is limping along with an economy that is not growing at the same pace, with unemployment not being at the same levels. Obviously, the Trump economy was far better than the Biden economy.
Now, with that in mind, we have seen that during the course of the Trump administration, $1 in $5 ever printed in the history of the United States was printed during the Trump administration. During the Trump administration, we saw about 30% of the U.S. debt be accumulated by the Trump administration. The Trump administration paid out direct payments to Americans on multiple occasions. In many ways, people will say that was a socialist government. The part of the reason we are in the debt crisis we are right now is because of the cost of the Trump tax cuts were never paid for. How can we argue that when President Trump was running up the country's credit card, that can be compared to Joe Biden, who's been paying down the debt to the tune of $2 trillion over the first 3 years of his administration?
So first off, you addressed a number of different issues there. So the first thing is that during the pandemic, there were payments that were made, but those were not enacted by Donald Trump. Those were things that were passed through both houses of Congress, and they were bipartisan, and they were a response to the pandemic. Just because they were bipartisan doesn't mean all Americans agreed with those individual payments that were made. It was that first inflush of cash that took away from the robust economy and set us up for a recession in later months. So I'm talking about the inflationary impact of all of those additional American dollars inside of our system. That was a negative. So every single thing that we saw during the Trump years isn't something that we would agree with, but it was still better, even including the pandemic years, than what we're going through under the Biden administration. So you named off a number of different things there that you were kind of ping-ponging around. The net effects, if you compare first year to first year of President Biden's administration and Trump's administration, the economies are like two different universes. President Trump oversaw a robust economic growth. President Biden crushed our oil and natural gas industry, canceled the Keystone XL pipeline, hit union workers where they hurt, because the majority of the Keystone XL pipeline workers were union workers, and then proceeded to enact actual executive orders that hurt the oil and natural gas industry, and then went around begging for oil and natural.
But hold on this point, are you denying that President Trump added literally trillions of dollars to the national debt with no intention of ever paying them off at all? He all these economic numbers are on the nation's credit card, and now Kevin McCarthy wants to cut social services. They want to cut benefits to families. They want to cut They want to cut veteran benefits to pay off the credit card that Donald Trump just ran off. Is that inaccurate?
No, I'm not denying that the national debt increased under Trump as it did under every other president before him. I am denying that the payments, the individual payments that you mentioned, were his idea. He signed them into law.
He signed them into law. So if he thought they were a bad idea, he could have vetoed the law, correct?
Yeah, and then what would you have said on cable news that he doesn't want to help people? Like you're mischaracterizing the cuts that
leadership is about doing what is unpopular. We're not electing a homecoming queen. We're electing a president. If he thought it was a bad idea, he could have vetoed it, correct?
On my show, I would not talk over you, nor would I ask a question and before you're done answering it, come back in with more questions or continue to make the conversation one in which your viewers can't hear what we're saying. So the answer to your question about the unpaid tax cuts is that is the same spurious, incorrect assertion that is constantly made by Democrats who want to increase taxes that actually tax increases hurt people that look like you and me. Low tax burdens don't hurt Black Americans. They help Black Americans because a robust economy is one in which all Black Americans can find work and begin to experience the American dream, as you and I are already doing. So a conversation about tax policy in this short amount of time that starts off with you saying that the Trump tax cuts weren't paid for, that's inaccurate. Of course they were paid for. And not only was the response in the business sector of our economy a good one, but we saw the largest increase in people who are at the managerial level or the retail level, the largest increase in bonuses and pay in the history of our country happened after the Trump tax cuts. So we can't talk about the Trump tax cuts without noting how good they were for Black Americans. We flourished during the Trump years. It doesn't matter what was said on cable news. We flourished during the Trump years. Lowest Black unemployment rate in the history of tracking that metric. So we can talk about the increase in the debt. I didn't like it. It wasn't my idea of good policy. But we were in a pandemic. It was unprecedented. People were trying to figure out what to do. We have also seen the debt increase under President Biden, but the biggest increase in regulatory pressure has also occurred under Biden, and also $87 billion for new IRS agents to level audits on people who earn like you and me. People who look like you and me will be the ones who are bearing the brunt of the audit pressure under the new IRS reality that's brought to us by the Democrats and the Biden administration. That hurts.
In a Republican primary, will this be something that some of the other Republican candidates hit Trump on? Some of these policies that they would consider in any other situation socialist? Will this be a situation where President Trump will find himself on the defensive against true economic conservatives who will be against many of the policies he put in place that did run up the national debt?
It's possible. And if so, I'm sure he has some people working on what his response to that will be. But I'm here because you asked me to come and talk about the primary, and I actually care just as much about what happens to Black Americans as you do. My work in my community is for that purpose, to advance not just Black Americans, but the wealth situations of all Americans, to make sure that all Americans have access to affordable health care, and to make sure that everyone, not just Black Americans, but everyone, can experience the true beauty of our American experiment. People aren't trying to get out of here, Roland. They're trying to get in. I'm sorry, Robert. They're trying to get in. They're trying to get into this country. So it's a great place to be, and I want to make it even greater.
Well, on this point, as we are continuing to talk about the Republican primary, I think one of the places that it's going to be difficult for any of these candidates is on this issue of national security and foreign policy experience. Other than President Trump, Nikki Haley seems to have the most experience when it comes to foreign policy. However, if you look at the Biden administration's foreign policy victories thus far, it's on an almost unassailable record. His foreign policy record is much stronger than even his domestic policy record. Which Republican candidate would have the best chance of actually going toe-to-toe with President Biden on much of what has happened internationally?
Well, so are you referring to the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan where President Biden left behind $87 billion of military equipment? I actually list every bit of that.
Well, hold on, because as you said, we're not talking over each other. One, the Afghan
mentioned foreign policy experience. I'm an Air Force, and I know a lot about foreign policy. I grew up overseas, and I actually can comment on this because I wrote a whole chapter about foreign policy in my book. So
understood, but we're talking about when we're talking about Afghanistan, we have to talk about Mike Pompeo and the Doha Agreement, the agreement with the Taliban that was struck between President Trump and the Taliban February of 2020, where they agreed to leave and they agreed to take the military troops out first. Secondarily, all of that military equipment was intended for the Afghan army. That was the point of that equipment. And right now, the Taliban army is using that equipment to fight ISIS-K. They just took out and killed the perpetrator of the attack at the airport. So I think it's incorrect to say that President Biden botched the withdrawal when he was simply going along the terms of President Trump's agreement with the Taliban. I'll turn it over to you.
Soldiers died during that withdrawal. 13 American soldiers died during that withdrawal. So that's 13 families who now do not have their family member because we pulled the military out first. So when you say that Trump or Pompeo signed that agreement, so anything that was signed during the Trump years, Biden has to abide by it. He rescinded all of the executive orders surrounding energy on day one. He reversed the Mexico City policy. So if he didn't think withdrawing the military first was a good idea, all President Biden had to do was reach out to the State Department or
those troops had already been removed in 2020. President Biden couldn't redeploy the troops. There were 5,000 troops taken out and soldiers released from prison in Afghanistan. This is a point of public record. We can't rewrite history.
Military veteran. You don't have the experience that I do serving on active duty in the military, nor your father or your grandfather or your great-grandfather as I do. You're not married to a veteran. You don't have generations of military service in your background. You have not sat through classified briefings, and you never held a security clearance.
So are we saying that this was not the terms of the Doha Agreement? That we can go through biography as much as possible. Did the Doha Agreement remove the U.S. troops from Afghanistan and release the Taliban soldiers into the public? It's a simple question. Did that happen?
That the issue here isn't the Doha Agreement or whether or not it happened. The issue is that Biden oversaw the withdrawal, 13 troops died, and we left thousands of people behind who helped us during our time in that theater of war. It was done incorrectly, and if Trump had overseen it, the left would never stop talking about it. So President Biden owns the botched withdrawal, and he definitely can't call that a foreign policy win. It was a failure that lowered our standing in the eyes of our partners around the world and will forever be seen as one of the worst military extractions in the history of military extractions ever.
So, but let's key back in on this point. Was this the agreement that President Trump and Mike Pompeo signed with the Taliban? Did they not agree to leave that equipment with the Taliban? Did they not agree to remove the U.S. troops prior to the withdrawal of the civilians? Did they not agree to release soldiers that were killed in military prisons, Taliban fighters, before removing the civilians? Were those not the terms of the Doha Agreement?
At no point during this conversation have I disagreed with you about the terms of the Doha Agreement. My response I already gave to you, and you overtalked me, so maybe that's why you're asking me the same question again, because you didn't hear me when I was speaking before because you were overtalking me. But this is under the Biden administration. It occurred on his watch. If he disagreed with the terms of the Doha Agreement, he could have simply implemented a new one, as he has done on every other policy, domestic and foreign, if he disagreed with it. 13 troops died during a terror attack because we did not have proper staging for the extraction. And that happened under the Biden administration. And blaming Trump for it as a deflection indicates weakness on the part of the support of those who support President Biden.
I don't think it's a deflection to correct the record as to what actually happened. But I appreciate you joining us and speaking on this topic. I think we're going to continue to have this conversation going forward into the primary season. And I think that when it comes to these issues of actual policy, that's a much better place to be at than some of the personality conflicts that people have. I think the people need to have the actual facts of what happened. I appreciate you for joining us. Thank you so much, Stacy. Where can people find the podcast and listen to you?
My radio show is on Sirius XM. We're live from 8 to 11 p.m. Central every night, north to south, east to west. And my website is stacyontheright.com.
Thank you so much, Stacy Washington, Stacy on the Right. For those of you who want to tune in and listen to her.